The storm that night rolled in heavy from the Atlantic, drenching the old plantation in sheets of rain that clung to the shutters and rattled against the glass. The candles flickered along the parlor walls, throwing shadows that danced like ghosts across the grand portrait of Captain Nathaniel Hargrove, once master of the estate, now buried beneath the magnolia tree that bent low from years of southern wind. His widow, Elena Hargrove, sat before that portrait motionless, her pale hand resting on the armrest of the rocking chair, as thunder rumbled in the distance. It had been 6 months since his death, yet the house still carried his scent, tobacco, leather, and the faint trace of the bay rum he used to splash across his jaw after every shave. She had dismissed the servants weeks ago, one by one, claiming she needed solitude for mourning. Only the wind and the echo of her own footsteps kept her company now, but those who passed by the Hargrove estate at night swore they saw candlelight moving through the rooms, and sometimes heard a woman's voice whispering softly to someone who could not answer. The plantation's neighbors, most miles away, whispered that grief had driven her mad. They said she spent her days wandering through the halls wearing her husband's uniform jacket and his wedding band looped around a silk chain at her neck. They said she spoke to his grave, laughing, weeping, begging. None dared visit after dusk, not even the preacher who came once a week before she sent him away with a smile too calm for comfort. Inside, Elena sat in silence, staring at the small wooden chest placed on the table beside her. It was sealed tight with a silver clasp, engraved with her husband's initials. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, the metal cold against her skin. She lifted the lid slowly, almost reverently, and the scent of formaldehyde and something darker wafted up, something human. Inside lay folded linen, blood-stained and stiff, wrapped around something she had not let anyone see since the night Nathaniel's body was brought home. She unwrapped it layer by layer until the candlelight fell across what was inside, a pale piece of flesh, cured and preserved, smoothed with oil until it gleamed like ivory. She touched it with her fingertips, and her breath caught. Her husband's flesh, the same she had cut herself, trembling, the night the undertaker left her alone to say good-bye. She had taken it from his shoulder, where she once used to rest her head. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "You promised you would never leave me." Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the shutters. Elena stood, clutching the folded piece of flesh, and crossed the room to the desk, where a small bundle of white lace and hair waited. For weeks she had been stitching it together, piece by piece a doll, a crude imitation at first, made of silk and cotton, but now layered with something more intimate, his hair, his skin, buttons carved from the same ivory that framed his portrait for the eyes. She had sewn his initials into the doll's chest, and around its neck she tied a strip of his burial shroud. Tonight she would finish it. The needle slipped into her finger as she worked, a droplet of her own blood mixing with the dried stains on the cloth. She didn't flinch. "Now we're one," she murmured, her voice low, fragile. The clock ticked past midnight. When she finally lifted the finished doll in her hands, her breath trembled with awe and horror alike. It was small, the size of a child's toy, but its face, stitched carefully from silk and faintly resembling his own, seemed almost alive in the candlelight. She placed it gently in the rocking chair opposite hers, adjusting its collar as though dressing her husband for Sunday Mass. "Nathaniel," she whispered, "you can hear me now, can't you?" Silence, only the sound of rain against the window. Elena leaned forward, eyes wide, as though waiting for a whisper in return. "I kept my promise," she said softly. "You said you'd always be with me, and now you are." In the days that followed, the townsfolk grew uneasy. The milkman who delivered to the Hargrove estate said he saw her through the window, sitting across from that rocking chair, nodding and speaking in tones too tender for prayer. One morning he swore he heard laughter, 2 voices, one distinctly male, but when he knocked at the door, no one answered. The widow rarely slept. Each night she would light the candles and speak to the doll, her words slipping between affection and reproach. She told it of her loneliness, her anger at God, her desire to feel his hand again upon hers. And then, one night, as the wind screamed through the magnolias, she heard it, a faint creak from the rocking chair. Slow, rhythmic, back and forth, her heart pounded, but she didn't scream. Instead, she smiled. "You came back," she breathed. After that night, no one saw her in the daylight again. The shutters stayed closed, and only the faint glimmer of candlelight betrayed life within the mansion. Rumors spread of strange noises, whispered lullabies, the sound of footsteps pacing through empty halls. The preacher who finally dared enter weeks later found the house cold and still. Dust gathered on the furniture, the fire long dead. But in the parlor, before the portrait of Captain Hargrove, sat two chairs facing each other. In one, the doll; in the other, Elena Hargrove, dressed in black, her head slumped forward, eyes open and unseeing. Her hands clasped something against her chest, the doll's hand, stitched crudely from human skin, and on the wall behind her, in her own handwriting, scrawled in what looked like dried blood, were the words, "We are one now." The days following Elena Hargrove's death were veiled in silence. The townsfolk of Charleston whispered about what the preacher had found inside that house, the widow seated beside a doll made from her husband's flesh. The authorities sealed the estate, though few dared to enter again. Yet, before that grim discovery, before her final breath and the inked words that chilled the soul of every man who read them, something had begun to happen inside those walls that none could explain. The second month after she completed the doll, Elena had slipped further into her nightly rituals. The parlor became her chapel, the rocking chair her altar. She no longer saw the doll as a creation, but as a vessel, her husband reborn through her devotion and the unholy mingling of their flesh. She had begun to call him by his name aloud again, sometimes scolding, sometimes laughing, sometimes weeping until dawn. Each night she would prepare the same ritual, lighting 7 candles in a half circle around the doll, placing Nathaniel's wedding ring at its tiny feet, and whispering psalms she could barely recall correctly. Her words would dissolve into murmurs, half prayer, half plea, as though she were calling him out of the grave. At first nothing happened, but by the 7th night, as the storm rolled through again, Elena claimed she heard it a sigh, soft, human, close enough to brush against her cheek like a breath. She froze, clutching her shawl, staring at the doll whose glass eyes caught the candlelight. The faint creak of the rocking chair followed. Then stillness. She laughed then, a wild, trembling laugh that echoed through the hallways. "You're here," she whispered. "I knew you would come." By the next morning she had placed a plate of food before the doll, a cut of meat, a biscuit, and a small glass of brandy. The servants she had dismissed months earlier would have called it madness, but Elena was certain she saw the crumbs disturbed the next day. She began dressing the doll each evening in her husband's clothes, his gloves, his waistcoat, even the black ribbon he used to tie his hair. Every dawn she would wash its face gently with rosewater and whisper, "You must look your best for the day." Visitors began noticing odd things about the Hargrove property. The old gardener, who returned one afternoon to tend the magnolias, claimed he saw a man's figure standing in the upstairs window, broad-shouldered, motionless, but when he called out, the shape stepped back into the shadows and vanished. Another villager swore that he heard humming coming from inside, a deep baritone tune that had once been Captain Hargrove's favorite hymn. By June, Elena had abandoned her bed altogether. She slept on the floor of the parlor, her body curled near the rocking chair. Each morning she would awaken with marks on her arms, faint, finger-like impressions that she could not explain. She told herself it was a sign of his touch. But sometimes, when she caught her reflection in the window, she could swear she saw 2 figures standing behind her, one solid, one faint, both smiling. One stormy night she awoke to find the doll had been moved. It no longer sat in its chair. It was on the floor beside her pillow, its hand resting on her wrist. The candle she'd left burning had been snuffed out. She should have screamed, but she didn't. Instead, she whispered, "You missed me too." After that, she began writing letters addressed to Nathaniel, dozens of them hidden inside the desk drawers, each filled with lines that blurred the line between devotion and delirium. In one she wrote, "You live through me now. They will never understand what we share. They will call me mad, but love has no rules in the afterlife." In another, "The skin feels warmer each night. I know you're trying to come back to me." By the time July's heat settled over the estate, the smell began. Sweet at first, faint as lilac, then stronger, heavier, like something decaying beneath the walls. The groundskeeper refused to go near the property again. The preacher sent letters, begging her to let him in to pray with her, but she returned each envelope unopened. Inside, Eleanor's world had become a mirror of her obsession. The portraits of her ancestors were covered with cloths. The furniture had been pushed aside to make room for the nightly ritual circle. She began to sleep less, eat less, speak only to the doll. And the doll, it seemed, was learning to speak back. She heard it in the quietest hours, a whisper from the chair, faint and rasping, as if from a throat unused to breathe. Eleanor. The first time she heard it, she fell to her knees and wept. The next morning, she swore she saw it move, not in a dream, but in daylight, the doll's head turning ever so slightly toward her as she crossed the parlor. She stood frozen, trembling, waiting for it to move again. It didn't, but when she reached for it, she felt warmth beneath the silk skin, as if something pulsed faintly beneath. That night she slept beside it, murmuring to it like a child, her fingers entwined with its stitched hand. Weeks passed. The sound of footsteps echoed through the halls, though she was alone. Windows opened by themselves. The grandfather clock began to chime at hours it had never marked before. Once she found muddy footprints trailing across the floor, boot prints, the same size Nathaniel's had been. They led from the front door to the parlor, stopping before the chair. Her journal entries from that period became erratic, written in a trembling hand. He is returning to me. The doll is no longer a doll. The flesh remembers. Another read. He is jealous. He watches me even when I sleep. I mustn't anger him. The handwriting grew more disordered, the ink blotted as though written in haste or fear. On the final day of August, a violent storm struck. The rain came sideways, wind tearing through the magnolia branches. Neighbors miles away claimed they saw flashes of light around the Hargrove estate, not lightning, but firelight, glowing through every window. Some said they heard screaming, though no one could tell if it was fear or ecstasy. Then, just as suddenly, it went silent. When dawn came, the sky was clear. The estate stood dark, the air still heavy with smoke and salt. No one dared approach until days later, when the preacher arrived again. The door was ajar, the parlor untouched except for one thing, the rocking chair, swaying gently, though there was no wind. The doll sat upon it. Its silk face glistened faintly, as if damp with sweat, and behind it, drawn in black ash across the wall, were the words, "Do not separate us." The preacher returned to the Hargrove estate one last time in early September. By then, the smell had spread beyond the gates, carried on the wind through the magnolia grove. The townsfolk had begun to speak of curses again, of restless spirits that haunted the family's land since the war. But the preacher was not a man who believed in superstition, at least, not until he opened the parlor door that morning. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of mold, and candle wax long burned to nothing. Dust hung in the beams of light spilling through the shutters, and every surface glistened faintly as if slick with moisture. The rocking chair sat still now, but the doll was gone. He called her name once. "Mrs. Hargrove." No reply. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he stepped deeper into the parlor. The portraits had all been turned toward the walls. The mirrors were draped in black. But what struck him most was the faint sound, a whisper, not from his own echo, but from the far corner near the hearth. A woman's voice, soft and rhythmic, like someone speaking in prayer. He turned, and there she was. Eleanor Hargrove stood barefoot by the fire, though it was long dead, her gown the color of ash. Her eyes were open but unfocused, her lips moving in quiet conversation. In her hands she held the doll, or what remained of it. The silk had rotted away, revealing bone beneath, human bone gleaming faintly in the dim light. She was stroking its cheek with trembling fingers, humming softly. "Eleanor," the preacher whispered, his voice breaking. "You must put that down. It isn't him." Her head turned slowly toward him. The smile that spread across her face was both tender and terrifying. "You're wrong, Reverend," she said. "He's with me now. He came back. He just needed time." The preacher took a step closer, his hands raised in calm. "That thing you hold, it's not your husband. It's a trick of grief. The devil preys on." She laughed, cutting him off. "The devil? Oh, no. Nathaniel was no devil. He was a good man. He worked hard, loved hard. He just couldn't bear to leave me alone." The preacher saw movement then, small, twitching, subtle. The doll's head jerked slightly toward him, its mouth parting with a faint crack of dried sinew. For a moment he thought he heard a sound, low, guttural, almost a growl. He froze, whispering a prayer beneath his breath. "Do you see?" she said, clutching the doll tighter. "He can hear you. Elena, please." He pleaded, "Let me help you. Let me bury him properly." But her expression hardened. "He doesn't want to leave me," she said. "He told me so. He speaks every night now. He walks the halls when I sleep. He forgives me for what I did." "What you did?" the preacher asked. Her eyes glistened as a single tear rolled down her cheek. "You wouldn't understand. He died too quickly. They said it was the fever, but I know. It was the guilt. He had secrets. I helped him keep them. I helped him atone." She stepped closer, holding the doll between them like an offering. "When they took his body away, I wasn't ready. He wasn't ready. So I gave him back what he'd lost, a piece of me, a piece of him. Now we're whole again." The preacher recoiled as he saw it clearly. The stitches along the doll's torso, rough and uneven, the same thread used to mend clothing. But beneath it, faintly visible, was something beating. Slow, rhythmic, a pulse. He dropped his Bible and stumbled back. "In God's name, Elena, what have you done?" Her smile widened. "God had nothing to do with it." The air in the room seemed to shift, the candles flickering though none were lit. The doll's head tilted, its mouth opening wider now, and a faint sound escaped, half sigh, half whisper. The preacher couldn't move. The widow's hand stroked the doll's hair as she whispered, "He's waking." And then, impossibly, she pressed the doll's face against her chest, whispering, "Breathe, my love." The preacher fled. He didn't stop to look back, not when he heard the creak of the rocking chair begin again, not when the voice behind him said, clear as a bell, "Close the door, Reverend." He ran until he reached the church, his heart hammering, his hands shaking so violently he dropped the keys at the door. When he returned days later with the sheriff, the house was empty. No Elena, no doll, no trace of blood. Only the rocking chair remained, swaying gently in the draught. They buried an empty coffin beneath the magnolia tree where Captain Hargrove lay. The preacher refused to speak of what he saw again, though in his final sermon before leaving Charleston he said only this: "Love can bind stronger than death, but some bindings were never meant to hold." Years passed. The estate rotted away, overtaken by vines and silence, but travelers along the road at night still tell the same story. They say if you stop by the Hargrove plantation when the moon is high, you can see a faint light in the parlor window, a woman's silhouette rocking gently beside another, smaller shape. Some swear they've heard laughter drifting through the trees, followed by a man's voice, deep and low, whispering her name, Elena, and if you listen long enough you might hear her reply, soft as the wind through the magnolias, "I told you we'd never be apart."